Okay. So thanks everyone for joining on time. And just want to welcome everybody. My name is Akshay, and with me is Yashna. We're both co-founders of Ooloi Labs, and we're really excited to welcome you to our webinar around the role of qualitative data in localizing sort of climate adaptation. At Ooloi, we really believe that qualitative data plays a crucial role in shaping climate adaptation strategies, amongst other things, especially where those strategies are locally relevant, they're community driven. And a lot of the conversation around climate action we feel is driven by quantitative metrics, which is not bad. There's a lot of value in that, but there's a lot of value in understanding the lived experience of communities, the patterns they observe, and the solutions they develop because they're already adapting to changes. And so we feel that this webinar is coming at a very important time as climate related challenges, both the challenges themselves and the ways that as society we're dealing with them or not dealing with them continue to intensify. And so what we're going to explore today, it's not a lot of time, less than 90 minutes. We're going to explore how storytelling and lived experiences and qualitative research can provide deeper insights into climate adaptation efforts, and particularly in the regions that are most vulnerable to these changes. We're going to hear from three great experts working at the intersection of climate adaptation, resilience, and community driven research and communications. Uh, it's going to be an informal conversation. We're going to discuss experiences, challenges, some key learnings. And before we dive in, I'd just like to introduce our speakers. So we have Vinuta Gopal. She's the CEO and co-founder of Asar, which she co-founded in 2016, and which has grown to support a diverse group of consultants, networks, and organizations addressing climate action. She's worked on the ground with communities and developed campaign strategies at the national and international levels. Vinuta, along with Asar's Brikesh and Sanjeev, were selected as a team into the prestigious Climate Breakthrough Award program in 2022. She was previously program and co-executive director of Greenpeace India, where she worked since 2002 and has also led the climate and energy team for close to a decade. Shuchi is the head of learning at the Global Resilience Partnership. She has more than a decade of experience in designing and implementing community-led programs for droughts, floods, urban and rural water resilience, and especially approaching them from a transdisciplinary and systems change lens. Currently, she's the head of learning, as I mentioned. She's also currently an Indo-Pacific Leadership Lab Fellow at the East-West Center, University of Hawaii. She has previously worked at the Nature Conservancy and WWF and has master's degrees from Oxford and TIS, and started out as a chemical engineer by training from NIT Warangal. Nupur is a research associate at the Climate Adaptation Learning Lab Transitions Research. She's an urban strategist and designer, and at Transitions Research, her work focuses on strategizing interdisciplinary solutions for the built environment with a focus on equity in climate resilience and building stewardship in communities. She holds a master's degree in urban design from the College of Environmental Design at UC Berkeley and a Bachelor of Architecture from Anna University. And we're really honored to have them join us today. And I'm very happy that when I reached out, they almost immediately all three said yes. And so I'm glad that finally it's happening. We've been in conversation for a few weeks. Really quickly, going to share with you what are some of the key topics we're going to cover. Um, the role of qualitative data in understanding effects of climate change and how it differs contextually, the role of indigenous knowledge and solutioning in the face of these contextual challenges, and very importantly, how does this data that gets collected make its way back to communities and inform their action. Those are going to be three larger themes which we'll use to break up the conversation. Just some housekeeping notes. Please, stay engaged, ask questions. We're using a normal Zoom thing, but I would request you to kind of stay on mute. But please use the chat for all your comments and messages. It certainly makes the conversation richer. We're not on a script as such, so where we can pull in some of the comments, we will. And at the end, we will have time for audience comments and questions as well. And like I mentioned, the session is being recorded. And what we'll do is after the webinar, we'll put this up on YouTube, share a link, and our speakers might refer to some specific resources, and so we'll share links to those resources as well through the Luma where you register. Um, so without further ado, I think we can kind of get started. Um, let's jump right into like our first segment around the role of qualitative data. And so the first question, I'm just going to put it forward to Suchi and Nupur. Uh, in your work and experience, what are the sort of deficiencies that you see in our understanding of local issues and adaptation strategies? And how can sort of qualitative data help us understand that? And, it would really help if you can provide some specific examples of how qualitative data has revealed insights that maybe quantitative data alone could not have done.
Do you want
So,
me to start?
yeah, sure, Suchi.
Great. All right. So I think so. I want to say hi to all the familiar names I can see on this list of audience. Lovely to see all of your names, and hopefully I'll see some of your faces soon if you're off video. So great to see you guys. You know who all you are. Uh, okay. Starting out with the thought around qualitative data and qualitative approaches. So it's not to say that qualitative data actually can or should aspire to replace quantitative in any way, because there is value to both. So I'll start with that context, because both are extremely rich in their own insights, and we need both to be able to create the right kind of insights. What we need is a bridge between the two and the ability to understand the two. The role of qualitative data is especially important because of the embedded uncertainty. We assume that we understand nature entirely, but quantitative data can be reductionist in that space, and therefore we need qualitative data to fix those gaps. The second way in which qualitative data is extremely useful is where there is data deficiency, especially when it comes to climate and local approaches, where qualitative data is crucial in spaces where downscaling would result. I mean, for those of you who understand quantitative data sets, climate modeling and adaptation has depended on downscaling of global and regional climate data models. So what they do, what you see in the IPCC, the RCPs are actually scenarios built out of those climate models. So essentially, where we have less data, so all of Africa. Charles Tonui, I'd like to kind of a very good article by Arun. So Charles is on the audience. They've written a brilliant article around Africa is gray, right? And most data sets, most quantitative data sets show up as gray, show Africa as gray, right? So that data deficiency kind of is important to be fixed by qualitative data sets. And I think the third aspect where qualitative data is extremely useful is when we think of how local people react, respond, are proactive, because people are resilient. People are not responding or waiting to respond based on long-term data sets or quantitative approaches. Neither are they making rational decisions, right? So they are making decisions based on the best knowledge that they have, and therefore are kind of responding the way they can. So that's it, as
They're
simply
not
put it.
waiting. They're not
No, they're
waiting
not
to make
waiting for any
saves.
of us.
And yes,
Yes, they are not waiting for any of us
exactly.
to give them extremely amazing insights. So in fact, it's the other way around. We
Yeah.
learn better from the ingenuity of the way people are responding to climate change, right? And how they're responding. And we can kind of build that better into bringing scale to the ingenuity of humans who respond. So from that, I mean, when I say all of this, I'm talking about all of this also backed with experience. When I was working in Kenya, this was back in 2017-18, where I was working in the Mara River Basin. And what I was doing was trying to understand how climate change is impacting environmental flows in the river, and how uh, eco-hydrological adaptation is important for the conservancy to exist, for if conservation is important and if tourism is an important source to their economy, how can that conservation continue, because the river is a lifeline to that area. Now what I realized is there are so many other factors that are not even part of formal discussions around eco-hydrology, where qualitative data around how people are responding to the amount of water they are extracting from groundwater, because there is no groundwater data from those parts, because sensors get, believe it or not, get knocked down by hippos or get grabbed by crocodiles. So none of these sensors get, stay on for really long. So
Mhm.
flow data and groundwater data, piezometers, these don't exist in the way that they should in these areas. So while proxy data can be used, qualitative data is extremely rich to understand some of this. Secondly, animal behavior gave those links. I spent some time there just to understand animal behavior, and that gave me links to how the balance in the ecosystem is maintained over the long term, and how people are responding to when there is less water in the river, and how the Maasai guides respond to times when there is less water in the river. So all of that, kind of the balance between the human, the animal, the nature, and the river is something that's, in many ways, I may sound philosophical, but it's this is the qualitative conversation. So it's
Yeah.
something that is overestimated by our rational human selves. So I guess I'll stop there and
Okay.
hand over to
A
Nupur.
great setup, I think, to this whole conversation. Lot of points, I think, that we're going to build on. So thank you for that, Shuchi. Nupur, same question to you. How are you seeing that in your work? And
So thank you for having me here. It's great to push this conversation on qualitative data. I think we have found in a lot of our use cases that quantitative data helps us identify trends in temperature, heat, like kind of what is happening to the environment around us. But you need some sort of qualitative research to understand how communities are perceiving these changes and
mm,
how are they experiencing them. And that is something that we will never be able to tell across a screen or across, unless you go and kind of really speak to them. Like for example, in a lot of our work on heat adaptation, we were able to quantify increase in temperature, we were able to understand how you can reduce it. But to identify adaptation strategies, we had to understand how different groups are impacted differently. Like for the elderly who are indoors, you need a different heat adaptation strategy vis-a-vis workers who work outdoors or on the field. So I think one for us, quantitative data is great to understand the impacts of climate change, but really understanding how communities are facing them and where we can intervene in terms of adaptation has been useful. Another case study that I can talk about is we were trying to understand the finance gap for locally led adaptation. Like how do we bridge that for the, and like we all know that there is some sort of a gap between funders and fundies, and how do we bridge that? How do we make them talk to each other? And something that we learned from speaking to organizations that work on locally led adaptation is that a lot of emphasis in these proposals is given on past experiences of the scale of finance they have received. So they are judged a lot on that, and organizations were making the case that you should be evaluating our capacity to do these projects over our scale of past funding. So
mm,
that is an insight that emerged only with various community interviews, so on and so forth, which is not something we could have predicted unless we had done that whole process of research. But now that's great for us to go back to people who are writing these grants that this is something you should test for. You should test for organizational capacity as opposed to just past experiences. But yeah, these are just two examples.
fantastic. Thank you. Wow, that is powerful. I mean, especially given that these organizations have to do new things at unprecedented scales. It should not get anchored in what that history has been, right? But also the capacity to grow and to grow into this work that they have to do. That's really interesting. again, each thing I keep thinking I need to go much deeper, but I'll pull back my own curiosity here for a second. Vinuta, I think just based on how Shuchi and Nupur set us up, I think the question I want to give to you is something Shuchi kind of talked about is the interrelation between, human, wildlife, nature, um, ecosystem kind of elements. And I think like you and I have been over the last few months been talking about commons so much and the depletion of the commons. And that I think so much of that conversation there has been around this these tensions within these systems and these needs. And so if you can answer this question through that lens also a little bit and kind of cue up some of the work that you all have been doing, bringing these worlds together.
Yeah, thanks so much, Akshay and Ooloi, and wonderful to meet all of you. I think, like you said, Akshay, Shuchi, and Nupur have, set it up really nicely, and many different ideas and thoughts to follow up on. But to sort of connect it in some ways to something real as well. Uh, the thing with quantitative data is that it while it provides analysis, while it provides a sense of trends, like Nupur said, what it doesn't really account for and doesn't provide motivation for is how do we actually motivate ourselves to do something about it. And I feel their qualitative research and the importance of engaging through a qualitative manner is extremely critical. I also think that the climate impacts are emergent. Like, as much as a model will tell you, it doesn't know what's going to happen in Koraput district in Orissa. So the quality, the experience of the people in the district become really important, and how to capture that experience in a way that also ends up shaping policy and practice becomes really important. So one of the things I like to possibly speak about here, and which is in relation to the commons, in relation to I think capturing sort of the experience of people in the community on how the commons was sustaining them and how that has changed over a period of time. So we actually did focus group conversations with women, led by women from the community, with members of their community, that captured through these focus group conversations, really, the experience of how over a 10-year period things had changed in their lives, especially in their dependence on the commons, and how the commons were changing, the how much what tendu patta they collected, and what over 10 years ago, and what they're collecting now, how that's changed, how the water situation has changed, how the foods that they collected has changed. So that actually enabled us to dip into the experiences and the sort of the oral histories of the people. And then we mapped that onto a map. Uh,
Mm.
Again, done somewhat partly visually and also partly, with data, which then enabled them to take that sort of map to see how things were shrinking. So we actually brought the revenue maps as well, and their own sense of the landscape of the commons, and tried to collate the two. And from that emerged a very interesting exercise of actually seeing how their resources were shrinking, and shrinking very rapidly, and what experience that was then leaving them with in terms of how their lives had changed, which
Mm.
was the motivation really to go and develop a different kind of Gram Panchayat plan. So I feel like, and this is not just communities, this is all of us. Ultimately, we don't respond to rational data presented to us. We may go and get a blood test done, and our cholesterol levels are really high, but that doesn't by itself motivate us. But the next time we like fall seriously ill, that may motivate us, to change our lifestyle. So I feel like data is really important, like Shuchi said, and quantitative analysis is really important, but very often it's qualitative that provides an experiential understanding of why we need to do something different or what we can change.
Okay. I have two segues, but I'm going to hold one of them for now for the next segment. You brought up this whole thing around maps as an interesting kind of method, right? Cartographic methods. And I think one of the questions in the registration form, we asked people for what they were curious about. And there were a lot of questions around what are these methods that we use or tools that we use to really get this qualitative data. So you mentioned a couple of these methods, right? Nupur mentioned one of the like interviews, focus group discussions, cartographic methods, very, very interesting. Just want to kind of take a step back and ask all three of you if you all can just share a couple of more examples around some interesting methods that you all have seen work, especially given what we're talking about climate. So Shuchi, maybe first to you, right? Like in the work that you've done, how are people sharing, experiences or illuminating connections that, emerge as they kind of adapt to changes?
I think, yeah, I think great question. I think what is exciting me the most currently is what I will focus on. And that's approaches that include arts. So
Okay.
all forms of arts, right? Because what we've been using arts for until fairly, recently is to communicate science, and that's one way of like that's unidirectional one way sort of communication of science. Someone who understands science makes art out of it and puts it out in public. But increasingly we are seeing, I mean, we've tried at GRP, what we've tried to do is we use this as an experiment. We gave out grants for the last 2 years to folks who may be connecting science and arts and using arts as evidence. So it's not just arts for art's sake, but really using arts as evidence. And what we realized was some really interesting work in Nepal, where flood maps were prepared using murals, where people's
Mm,
kids' heights were used as as data for, oh, the floods were above me or the floods were until here. So it was, and those kids were then themselves painting, so their experience, lived experience, was getting translated into a flood model that became a mural. So it was a very concrete sort of arts and public engagement use that came into play for flood resilience in that area. Similarly, we have folks working on ocean resilience, coastal resilience in South Africa. We have someone who's doing amazing work on soundscapes and how that is affecting resilience, and how we are adapting to that. And so what he's doing is he's creating music using resonant frequencies from plants. So the
okay.
plants' resonant frequencies are then translated into a rhythm or a pattern which is used as a music.
Okay.
So brilliant work like that, and it just kind of blows me that all of this can be real evidence to what how we are, how climate change is overall impacting us, how we are adapting to it, what we are losing, and what is that grief that's sitting with us, we have what that we haven't even acknowledged. I mean, soundscapes was not a grief that I had acknowledged until I heard what he was doing, so things like that. And the other piece of work that has excited me for a long time, for a really long time, was mindset shifts, and mapping power, agency, and mindset shifts through systemic tools, which necessarily involves transdisciplinary facilitation, and these are elements where you have both. These are approaches of collecting data, but it's also an approach to give back, because it's also people who are part of the process are also shifting their own mindsets as they are part of the process. So there's that role of everyone's the expert in the room, everyone's sharing and learning, and everyone's the community in the room as well. So we are all part of the system, and we are also all experts, whether it's a farmer or a woman who herds goats, or it's me as the facilitator, or it's a hydrogeologist, or someone who's passed out of IIT. And I've enjoyed doing this piece. Haven't gotten to do much of it, but it's something that has really excited me for a while. That kind of mindset shift is critical to to address this bridge of qualitative quantitative as well, because even the folks who are doing either need to acknowledge the limits of both.
There,
There needs to be that bridge in place.
yeah,
So yeah, so both of these, I think, and I shall let Nupur and Vinuta
yeah.
talk the rest.
No, I think just that thing of grief for what we have lost,
Yeah,
right, is such another webinar
I think
in
so.
the future. Well, I think there's so much there, right? Like, but thank you for setting us up and completely unexpected direction that took. So great. Nupur.
Yeah, I totally echo Suchi's enthusiasm for these sort of alternative strategies. Like, we really want to move away from a place of doing qualitative research where we go and ask questions and expect answers to those questions, right? And we're not getting those stories that we really want to do. So things that we are trying to explore right now include, we're also trying to do things with arts, where we're also trying to encourage people to express themselves differently, because we feel like text has, like, talking in general has a lot of barriers. And so we're trying to ask them to, say, draw their perceptions of how climate is impacting their house, or draw their perceptions of how their neighborhood is being impacted, which like gives us things that we won't really get. We're also trying to develop games that we can play with communities, that we go on site and we say, because we think like they will tacitly tell us something that we might not be able to do. But that's also interesting on how different climate situations. Another thing that we're exploring recently is we're doing work on human settlements and health, and how climate change is impacting those. So we're trying to do exercises where we bring different stakeholders from different parts of the world and ask them to map the power dynamics between the stakeholders to see where we can intervene, who's most vulnerable. So things like that. What's interesting is when you give them a sort of exercise, the conversations that emerge, like, those are really insightful, as opposed to like asking different people the same question. So I think that's been interesting.
It changes the nature of a focus group, right? Games are especially interesting because I think people sort of lose themselves. That's the point of a good game, is the magic circle, right? If you're in the magic circle, you forget who is asking me what, and you are in that, and then a lot of the tacit kind of comes out in that sort of situation. And you can also model fairly complex things within a less pressured environment, but still with some element of that the dynamic intact. So I think games are also such an interesting one. Uh, Vinuta, back to you with this question, just sort of circling back, and then we can kind of move forward. Um, uh, I, Nupur mentioned stories, and I know that's such an important part of how you function and what you all work on as well. If you want to talk about that a little, kind of how does storytelling kind of play out, and then what are the strategies that you're using for the enabling storytelling?
Yeah, no, certainly. I think both, I think, connecting emotionally, because we don't always operate on in a rational manner. So I think emotional connects become really important, and there the question is really, how are we even engaging multisensory aspects of ourselves in gathering information. So I actually want to go back to one of something our partners did, Equinoct in Kerala, along with others. They actually worked with a theatre group. And this was about tidal flooding. So this was people who were experiencing in Ernakulam district. They were experiencing water ingress into their house, into their homes on a regular basis. So the tide comes in and goes out, but Earlier, the tide wasn't entering their homes, but now with sea level rise, tides are, and the change in the geography, tides are beginning to enter their homes on almost a regular basis. So the community themselves came together and worked with a theater person to actually design a play about tidal flooding. And interestingly, the play, when it is staged, is actually staged in water. So they actually create, they create the stage wherever they're going to, do the play. They actually create this experience of being in water, and they speak about their life. And it's an extremely powerful way of communicating. First of all, it was a experience to even create the
Mm.
play, where they actually got they by talking to each other and by making the play happen, they got a sense of the enormity of what they're experiencing. It's not just happening to them. It was not just a natural phenomenon. They realized that it's actually happening with connections to what's happening in the world. And so they made those connections, and the play itself has been extremely moving every time it's staged. And what it then does to the audience is understand tidal flooding very differently from if I showed them a series of maps, or if I showed them a series of data sets that said, this is happening for, 150 days in a year or something like
Yeah.
that. So I felt, so storytelling, I think it can be really powerful, and we are hoping actually that they can stage it to legislative members in Kerala. So it can even change, decision makers.
Mm.
So yeah, it's an extremely powerful tool in engaging people emotionally, which actually I feel ultimately realizes new kinds of action.
Uh, Thank you. Powerful stuff. I'd love to kind of experience that, although I don't know if I have the resilience to make it through, the whole thing without breaking down. But I think let's move to something based on, something you mentioned now, also around action. And one of the articles that you had shared had this really nice line in it. This is not a story of resignation and despair, right? And that really stuck with me. And and I think some of what I saw from the reports which he shared, Nupur shared, that and what you all have mentioned also, people are not waiting around for these silver bullet solutions or policy to finally get its act together or what have you, right? People are adapting, right? As they see with the knowledge that they have, with the resources that they have, the resilience is there to their best abilities. So how you see, and Vinuta, just to start off with you, um, how is that, how are these solutions being understood or captured, right? Like one is communicating it, but how do we first even find what people are doing and, you know, who's doing it? How is it happening? How are we capturing and making sense of it? Uh, yeah, just kind of setting that up.
Yeah. So just building on the story I started with on this theater thing that worked on tidal flooding. I think sometimes, especially with climate impacts, we put it down to this is just nature. I mean, it's getting hotter. That's how it is. Things are changing, and so
Once in 100 years, rainfall is causing the flood in
yeah,
Bangalore, Chennai, Mumbai, Delhi, whatever you want to say. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So I think one of the things that was important was to recognize that this is happening because of other things that are also happening, which maybe I don't have immediate control over, but I should have an opinion on. And
Mm,
yes, people are adapting to the best they can with the resources they have, because that's the way people act. But um, to change the system, we do need to come together to shift something bigger than what I can change in my own life.
Mm,
And I think that is where there is a power in collaboration and in coming together to see that this is the lived reality of many people. And therefore, decision makers can actually start addressing this problem. This is not my problem alone, it's a problem in the system. And so I think the question is, how can qualitative data, research, engagement uplift these lived experiences to actually shape decisions that are being made that also further then affect our lives. So I think that is where we'd like. So, for example, in this tidal flooding example, they actually recorded the number of days on a calendar. So we distributed, I mean, the Equinox distributed calendars across the districts where this was being experienced. What that then did was gave them a sense of, oh my God, so many days in a year, my house is actually flooded. And
mm,
so many people's houses are flooded. So when they came together across panchayats, they realized that they wanted, as a first step, Kerala to declare this a disaster,
mm,
because it was not being even recognized as a disaster because it happened. I mean, it's something that happened, so it's not like a one big rainfall that caused a flood. This is
mm,
like a regular thing that happens every day.
mm,
So 21 panchayats came together and said we want this declared as a disaster. Now these 21 panchayats are actually planning what the response should look like. And now that is ground up community owned planning that should go up um,
mm,
into the
mm,
state plans and then
mm,
into
mm,
higher plans. So I feel like, especially with climate, there is a very important part that is ground up. Uh,
mm.
and how we enable that, I think, um, qualitative means of actually gathering that information, sharing it collectively, and using that to inform our plans, inform our policies becomes very important.
There's an underlying thing that I'm taking away, right? And it's something that I think coming from Bombay, I used to hear, every monsoon, spirit of Bombay, right? Oh, Bombay floods, people are walking home 15 kilometers, and spirit of Mumbai comes up, right? But I think what that tends to hide, and sometimes if we look at how people are adapting and we celebrate or valorize that too much, correct, it can hide the fact that these are bigger issues that need to also be kind of attacked systemically, right? And these require those sorts of things, and then maybe you cycle it back in a way that the solutioning happens ground up, and maybe there are solutions there that could work, but we can't use the solutions to say, see, people are managing, right? It's a band-aid, even if it is that, right? It's almost like a fig leaf, not a band-aid, behind which some of this hides. But I think I'm just going to take that slightly burning ball and just push that to Shuchi, because I think you all talk about this, right? And how are people being resilient? What are the solutions? And I think there was a distinction that I read about that maybe I have not understood fully, and or I'd like you to explain around distinction between local action and locally led action. And I feel like maybe Vinuta is also sort of hinting at something like that. But if you can talk about this a little bit, both things.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And just two things. One, I've seen the play that Vinota is referring to. You're right. It's a moving experience, something that you really need to experience, sit through it and absorb and live through. Beautiful play, beautiful, very well done stuff. And that's not to take away the fact that it must be harrowing to live through that, especially. So, and the second aspect that you are saying about local action versus locally led action, I think the underlying aspect is the power an agency, who holds the power in that action, right? Local action, it's also very easy to say that locally led action can be local action, and exactly what you were saying. So people are managing, let them manage. There's valorization of that, and also sometimes setting local communities up for failure, saying that, oh, you have a plan, why don't you go out and just giving an example where a lot of this is actually said on various platforms where people say that we should give local communities direct access to philanthropies, finance, whether it's and even global finance like Adaptation Fund and Green Climate Fund, etc. Right? But just to kind of give them access is not going to, without the capacities to write grants and the way these structures are set up, without the capacities to navigate these structures, if we just give them access and we expect them to deal with this by themselves, then we are only valorizing their failure. We are setting them up for that failure, and we are valorizing their resilience anyway. So we're saying, go ahead, do, write proposals. We are giving you a free platform. We're giving you a free level playing field. But there is nothing like a level playing field, right? And we need to kind of understand that there's underlying power dynamics, underlying questions of agency and capacity that we need to plug, and which is where I think Vinuta's point around collaborations is critical, that in those spaces, then we as in whatever roles that we may take up, whether it's people who are managing data, people who are collecting data, people who are making data accessible, or even people who are writing grants, proposals, etc. We are the folks who need to support them through these processes until they can do this by themselves, right? Until they are capable. There may be certain groups that are capable to do this by themselves. Great. We should definitely uplift those groups in those spaces. But then there are those who can't, and those are the groups that we need to support. A community with better access to any kind of data, their own data, whether it's, what Vinuta was referring to, a calendar with the number of days that their place is flooded, even that in itself is a very powerful tool for them to have negotiating power in the space, right? And so as we keep adding on that access to data that they could get, whether it's qualitative in the form of stories or calendars or maps or tools, apps, the great apps that exist as well, right? And technology democratizes a lot of this as well. So, or even murals, paintings, flood models that may be murals, things of that sort, which allow them to access that data for themselves to be able to make decisions, is the first step that we can support them with. But then kind of moves on to how they access finance, how they are able to act, what their informed decision making looks like. And I think that's the crux of locally led action, that we are able to distinguish our role as so-called quote unquote experts in the process as enablers rather than as the doers of whatever action needs to be taken. So a lot of local action kind of drives on the fact that a lot of development programming is top down. It kind of drives home the fact that, okay, if we are breaking down the top down, then the only way up is bottom up, and therefore we leave communities to fend for themselves, to figure out their own finance and figure out their own science. But it doesn't work that way. So that's just that element of collaboration, element of working across scales, element of working across knowledge systems, and treating everyone as equals. It also requires new forms of understanding what these partnerships and what these systems and networks look like, right? And new ways in which leadership can also function. That's my sort of newest thought process that climate change requires leadership models that are different, because we all talk about collaboration, but collaboration doesn't come about by magic. So we need these different leaders of different types to come in and be able to, lead this kind of change, lead these kind of collaborations, be true to the communities we are working for. They are not beneficiaries. We are not doers. We are enablers. So that role shift and that mindset shift is super important for us, for us as experts or doers, quote unquote, of locally led or local action. We need to shift our thought processes. We are enablers, we are not the doers, and therefore what is it that is our limit in terms of what is it that we can do to support, rather than what is it that we can do and make a change or shift or introduce or transfer. So those vocabularies also need to change there.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, it's
yeah.
chicken and egg. What changes, the mindset or the vocabulary, or do I, force the vocabulary into the space so that it forces a mindset shift
Yeah, I
also,
mean,
right?
at the end of the day, it's internal, right? And therefore it's slow, because
Yeah, yeah.
it that comes with a conscious willingness to change. It's an unlearning and learning process
And to let go.
and to let go, exactly, and to let go.
Uh, yeah,
So yeah,
yeah.
totally.
Okay, I have two threads that I want to pull on over here. So first, going to Nupur, because I think one thing that we've been talking about is like what Shuchi kind of set up also was that if communities are taking these sorts of actions, right? And something Vinuta said earlier was climate impact is emergent, right? Something that I know you all have been kind of thinking about and talking about is what are the metrics for measuring success, right? And I'm double quoting that because, gosh, everybody has a point of view on that. But when you're doing something like this that is so contextual, that is emergent, what does that look like? What is your work showing you right now? I know I'm guessing you don't have an answer. If you do, that would be great because we can then close this whole webinar. But what's your work showing you around that? How do we go beyond carbon?
I absolutely think we need to. Adaptation is about measuring and improving the lives of people. And so metrics should be about social, economic dimensions that, and we should go beyond just carbon itself. We think from a lot of the work that we've done, one, measuring adaptation is challenging because there's no universally accepted metric that everyone kind of agrees on. So even communicating adaptation success is very difficult. But something that we believe in is metrics should be centered on the communities that you're working in. So things like what is the feedback that you're getting from the community? How much stakeholder acceptance are you getting of a particular strategy? And we also think it's really important for adaptation strategies or interventions to not be these one-offs that we go do this and then when that project is over, it just reverts back to its original state. So we really want to measure like how successful was this project in creating stewardship? How successful was it? Is there a sense of ownership that's coming from the community? So we think that adding those sort of metrics really help. We also think that the process of when you add the metric really helps. For example, generally we think resilience itself is an iterative process, right? It's not like a fixed outcome that we are going to work towards this and achieve this. And so
Now I
metrics,
am resilient.
yeah, exactly. No, it doesn't work that way. So metrics should also reflect that sort of dynamic nature. So we really think that at the onset of a project itself, we should be thinking about how do we measure the impact of this project and create that sort of measurement system that sustains itself through the lifetime of the project. So we are also not measuring success at the end of it. We're measuring success continuously and we're measuring success with the people who we are adapting for as opposed to kind
Mm.
of external communicators. So we really think that's very important. A very interesting example on this
Yes,
sort of
thank
is,
you.
we were looking at organic farming in Uttarakhand, and we were trying to say like how could you measure adaptation strategies that work in agriculture in that area. And something that emerged was we found a researcher who'd been doing participatory field research for about a decade or so. And he, with the understanding of these communities and seeing how they measure resilience and adaptation with farmers, came up with a metric called economic water productivity. So it was interesting because he was combining economic benefits, so like what they were like, creating out of their agricultural produce, but also like ecological benefits. So that was very interesting for us. The design of that metric came from participatory field research, right? So if we had not had qualitative data, we couldn't have designed that metric in the first place. So,
And
so that
what sort of qualitative data did this researcher leverage for this framework?
Yeah, so I think they were doing a lot of like in general working with the farmers, tracking how what sort of crop rotation was happening, what sort of irrigation systems they were employing, what was produce like, how the land reacted. We also think it's very interesting, like in case of farming in general, and even generally, I think with commons also, there's a relationship that communities have to their land and their water, and they understand it in a way that we will never be able to. And I
Yeah.
think we try to go at metrics with this sort of humility and respect for how they have lived with that land for generations, and try to understand what they are measuring. So, we have like the saying that like people like fishermen or fisher folks can draw the sea like you never can. We
Mm.
will understand it like this fixed mass of water, but they can really understand like what type of fish. So I think just leveraging that sort of like working with communities and with people who work in those fields, like with organic farming, we want to talk to farmers, or with water resilience, we want to talk to people who work around that. That's interesting for us to design metrics that actually correspond to successful adaptation, as opposed to some sort of we reduced carbon by so much.
Yeah. 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 Wow. Thank you. Vinuta, just coming back to one of the threads that Suchi set up was different kinds of leadership, right? Or what we, different ways of organizing. And I know there's so many different kinds of ways in which y'all have been working. And I'm guessing in the span of what you've done, different ways in which groups kind of come together. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. I know that, all this stuff, we've been trying to do with multi-actor platforms, for example, at a block level, the conference of panchayats, and I'm sure that there's a whole bunch of other examples. So just if you can talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. It's a hard one, I think. I think it's clear that we need different kinds of leadership. What that is, we don't know. So our approach to it has been that we don't know. So let's try many things,
Mm.
because it's not any one thing. And so, like you said, but I think what we've been really conscious of in the trying is that how do we ensure that bottom-up processes are strengthened? Because that has not been focused on. So whether it's the multi-actor platform processes, or the conference of panchayats. The conference of panchayats basically was a response to the climate negotiations, where you have the conference of parties, which is at the country level. And we said, why not panchayat leaders actually come together and discuss climate change, and something would emerge from that dialogue that actually spoke about and also panchayats have budgets, have decision making capabilities, and therefore it's a leadership that could actually take action that is significant. So it is not an insignificant level at which to have this conversation. And so I think what we are definitely attempting to do is to ensure that the conversation on responding to the climate crisis, first of all, is intersectional, because it is no one thing. So it is definitely not just carbon emissions, right?
Mm.
And the reason I guess carbon emissions became this thing was how easy it is to communicate. Like I can communicate 2 degrees as being, a tipping point. So it's easy when communicators have a single thing to say that everybody can latch on to. So carbon became that lightning rod that we can measure, we can, convert everything into a carbon story, but it's clearly not motivated people to change what needs to change. So I think
Or it's motivated the wrong things, right? It's the tail
exactly,
that's wagging the dog.
exactly. So I think one is that a complex story cannot be simplified. So we must be willing to live with complexity. And we must be willing to have many ways of telling the story. But I think it's important. I think the focus now on looking at things as a system is really critical. So what does a new leadership look like if you're changing the system? I think is a good question, because it cannot be centralized. A
Mm,
system is not going to change with centralized decision making and all authority sitting in one place. So I think leadership models that allow for decentralization, leadership models that allow for intersectionality. So we need to look at entirely new models that actually give space to these things, and how these then can actually claim policy space is really important, because otherwise it becomes a cute wonderful example that we will all say how wonderful, but it's wonderful that it happened, but did it actually shape something, and did it scale? So I think that's the challenge, but we need new things and we cannot hold on to the old. That's very clear.
uh, I think I'll just add a couple of points because I think I mentioned multi-actor platforms, but it may be good to kind of clarify what that's looking like in some of the work that we're doing is, one is taking landscape-based approaches seems to be, really coming in many different spaces. I'm seeing that happen, that depending on what landscape you're talking about, right? Depending on what your entry point is, it could be sub-basin scale, it could be looking at community conserved areas, for example, in the Northeast, or sometimes you start at an administrative boundary because everybody speaks that language, but in the end, the action starts happening around a particular watershed or things like that. And then how are you creating some sort of a meta structure that is supporting decentralized landscape level organizing and action and leadership within that, and that to a shared leadership. And I think in a recent kind of workshop we were in, we were trying to think about what are the examples of leaders we see in popular media, or I mean the news is turned into popular media, so in the news as well, which is a chest thumping leader, Pushpa, or Animal, or what have you, whatever that particular director's made recently, right? And I think the point is we're not seeing as much of the shared leadership kind of a model. And so how are we modeling that also? Um, so yeah, I just wanted to add that into the mix. I'm just conscious of the time. We're at 5. Okay. I'll just change gears a little bit on a question that's actually there in the chat. Oh, Smriti is dropping. I was going to just build on Smriti's question. But Smriti's question, and I had a version of that. Another question we have been thinking about in our teams, Smriti writes, how do we walk the fine line of abstracting challenges of marginalized groups facing threats of climate change when collecting and dispersing qualitative data without making it look like we're objectifying them as a group to make a point, right? So this kind of objectification or fetishization of the misery or the experience of that, right? Like, and from the sort of related question I had was, a lot of qualitative data or data collection in general has been extractive. One of the images I'd encountered in my research a few years ago was this nurse and doctor in Africa are tying pieces of paper to a helium balloon, and the balloon is going in. They are sending data up. The data never comes back, right? So these are sort of two related questions. I'll open it up to all three of you, not to any one person, if anybody wants to kind of jump in and respond.
Yeah, I guess I can start, and maybe Nupur, Vinuta, you can come in. Uh, this is something that has been, I guess it's been a North Star for me, and I'm sure for most others who are attending, speaking, also organizing. So, in terms of how do we ensure that that knowledge is that there's actually two-way learning, essentially. How do we ensure that it's when we talk about uh, data collection, it's not just collection that's extractive. And one of the things I think that has been that I have been very conscious about is whenever I'm, even if it's a survey, if I've done surveys at the beginning of my career, even when I started doing surveys, the I treated those surveys as relational. So there was something that, yes, I was gaining questions, answers to the questions that I was asking, but there was also something that the person was gaining back out of it. And that relationality in research builds that, and this is making it slightly abstract, but
Give
your
us an example of,
I'll give you an example. So I was
yeah.
working in the Devnar dumping ground. I started my research space career from there, and people in the slums in Shivaji Nagar have almost always been a set of numbers, for whether it's for the municipality or for researchers. There've been a set of numbers. When I went in, I knew life expectancy, I knew maternal mortality, I knew infant mortality, I knew their water access, their the number of toilets in that area, and so on, right? So I knew what the demographic numbers were. I was going in to study the complex linkages of what makes them systemically at a loss in terms of accessing water. So that was my primary study, that why is the water not reaching them, but what's the systemic barriers that's causing this. And my key informants there, without compromising on who they were, my key informants became as much subjects of my study as they were agents of change in their area. So whatever I was gaining out of them in terms of information, I made sure I fed back in terms of, okay, this is what I'm hearing. Is this how you're talking about it? This is what I'm hearing. But do you also want to say this? But is this without feeding, there's an issue of rigor where people are like, don't feed answers, which I wasn't doing. I was very careful of, but without feeding or assuming answers, ensuring that there is a relationality in that process. So each of them became agents of change within that space as well. In that short span of time, with whatever information I could once I had synthesized it, whatever information I could equip them with, I passed it on. They were using it, and I think that's critical. That are they being able to use that information, that data, as agents of change by themselves for their own, and that makes it relational in when you're collecting data, and in terms of what they are gaining out of it, what they are changing. Even if it is, and another example in Maharashtra, when we were working with local NGOs, farmers, experts, etc. The We were collecting data from those communities, but the relational aspect there was that while making the maps that they were also using that knowledge to build. While making the causal loop diagram maps, they were also gaining knowledge of their own systems, and they were also kind of going back with newer understanding of what is it that they want to change. So again, they were establishing their own. We heard back from a lot of them in terms of what how their mindset shifted around groundwater, for instance. Some of them became participatory groundwater management experts, basically barefoot hydrogeologists, or Bhujal Mitras, or whatever you want to call them in whatever terminologies. So there was as much data collection as there was giving back, um, and some of them, especially the local NGO, managed to use a lot of that data for their for change in that area. So because they were established there, because there was a trusting partnership, because I was not holding on to data as the outsider, I was ensuring that it was available for everyone. There was that relationality that was built in the
Yeah,
process.
I won't share the data back till my paper is
Exactly.
published, is what I've
Exactly.
heard
That's
a
the
lot of time.
that's the key issue, that I
Yeah,
can't share that data back with the people,
yeah,
or I don't care if if
yeah.
about the people who I needed to share that data with. So
I mean, that attitude, so I don't know what one does about. But I think,
yeah,
one interesting thing that you said is, I'm glad you shared the second example, because the doubtful voice in my head was, hey, that's easy when you're an individual researcher. Correct. What happens when you're doing these things as organizations at scale? is a
Yeah, it's a matter of values that you set as an organization, bottom line. I mean, you don't, I mean, we are in the development space because we have a certain set of values that is bringing us here. If we were not in these spaces, in fact, as an individual researcher affiliated to a university, I probably had more issues there of how much I can share and where I can share that data as compared to what I could do as a part of an organization, because I could push back. I could, show a set of written values and say, listen, we have these written, and these translate into me sharing that data with the communities I'm working with. So
uh, I'm just going to kind of invite Nupur and Vinuta into this, but one thing that I'm sitting with though, right, is also that riding that fine line between rigor and relationality, I feel like comes down not on values, but on the skill of the researcher then, right? Like, and like how much pressure you have on sample sizes. I've seen sample sizes in qualitative data completely kind of mess with these things. So I think that's something that I'm just going to sit with, because it's a hard one to kind of navigate. But Vinuta, Nupur, if you all want to jump in on this. Do you want me to repeat the question if no, okay. Yeah, Vinuta, go ahead.
Yeah, so no, I'm going to respond more because I'm not a researcher or
Sure.
I'm not coming at this from an academic
Yes.
perspective, but from
Yeah.
a more policy or
Yes.
change perspective. And so I think the question we've always asked ourselves when we do, when we collate information, qualitative, quantitative, has been how does that lead to some change? And there our focus has been how so citizen science. I think there was also a question on citizen science. So we've sort of tended to use research projects more towards citizen science and towards engaging communities, and getting them on board to make the case for a shift in policy or a implementation of policy or action. And that journey, I think, has been very valuable because you realize what interests the community or doesn't interest the community at all very quickly. Uh, and if we succeed, then the community actually takes it forward post the research piece. So I think our approach to it has been, is this information we want to gather because we want to change something? And are people with us on this, or is it something as a demand that's coming from people? So for example, we gather data on, we wanted to address clean cooking, which is basically, burning chulas has huge health impacts and also air pollution impacts. So we actually went to ASHA workers working in Delhi, in Bhalaswa, to say if we gathered air pollution information through quantitative data of putting up a monitor, but done by the local ASHA workers in working with women in that community. So they gathered the data, they understood what that data was, and then they came and presented the report to the Petroleum and Natural Gas Joint Secretary. And the way they communicated it was so clear as to what this was. So yes, I think I'll stop there because I think we felt that that process normally either is successful or it can fail. But if it is successful, it normally leads to that research being something that then leads to them getting engaged on the issue and also speaking much more confidently on the issue.
So I think what you're also saying is that, I mean, in a way, relating to what Suchi was saying is also that how do you bring people in at the earliest stage to say, is collecting this data going to be valuable for you? Right? Because you're looking at that longer arc of people themselves kind of getting together to present their needs to for shifts in policy, etc. But so how are they making the decisions on what data is collected or not? And maybe there is a participation there to say, hey, we can help with this quantitative data that is at scale or models or so on and so forth. And then, going through that process in that really a collaborative kind of way, right? That then there isn't a question of being extractive uh, or doing something for collection's sake in that sense, right? Interesting. Nupur.
Yeah, I think we all agree that any kind of research process where you're engaging communities and asking them to speak about moments and experiences in their life that are probably really painful to them has to be done with a degree of sensitivity. There are a bunch of things that we do to avoid kind of it feeling like an extractive process and see how we can give back. One of them that we like to do with adaptation specifically is focus a lot of our data and research on co-creation. So we try to kind of figure out what insight can you give us that we can kind of bring our skill set to and together create some sort of adaptation solution or strategy. So that's something we really try to do with the solutions. Something other ways of kind of with the visioning exercises that we do with cities or with residents in cities, we try and see if we can transform them to pilots. And in the process of this kind of data collection, if we can identify stakeholders that we can then connect to implement some of this, that's something we try to do. And there's also a lot of our reports, like we want to kind of investigate who we are writing the reports for and how useful it is for them, like who's actually going to read this. So we try for a lot of our reports to be documents that can be used by the communities for advocacy, for advocating with their state governments, or for funding from organizations. So that's something we try to do, look at the material and the research that we're putting out to see if it can be used for advocacy.
Wow, thank you. That was that's interesting. That I liked how you said with investigating who we're writing these reports for. Right? I mean, that's an important one to kind of keep being critical about also. Shuchi, you have your hand up.
Yeah, just an afterthought. I think as Vinuta and Nupur was speaking, I was thinking about this, and I think bottom line is we go in to listen first. And that kind of changes how we are not being extractive. If we were going in with like our own set notions, and goes back to those questions of collaboration, our role as so-called experts, and goes back to all the conversations of what is local versus what is locally led as well, that I think we're going in with the humility to listen first.
Mm,
And I think that was what I think that was something that was common among all of what we were saying, I guess.
yeah. Um, there's a couple of questions I also have. We're at 5:17, 18. Just encouraging people to put questions in the chat. We are already sort of answering them, weaving them into our conversation. So any more questions you have, just encouraging people to put it in the chat. I'm just going to ask this question around one of the things I've seen in some projects people talk about is ITK, indigenous traditional knowledge or things like that. Like, but also really saying that there are existing kind of ways of being and doing that work that, that require attention, that require those ways of doing persistent
Oh, I think there's a power cut or something. Ah, there he is.
Hi, am I back?
Yes.
I had an electricity outage. Yeah, so how do you go about capturing that? How do you go about then communicating that to other communities that could use it? Any thoughts on this as an exercise in itself, and then any examples that you might have of how one does that at scale, right? Other than like one researcher going somewhere, writing a paper about it, that kind of thing. How are we enabling that at a scale that makes it valuable, given at least this feeling of urgency of some of these practices kind of dying out, or just the nature of the shift happening, in climate change.
I'm waiting to see if anyone else wants to take it. Don't want to hog the mic, but but yeah. So please feel free to jump in, Nupur, Vinuta. But yeah, I mean that's a great question. I think what I've wrestled with is and I'm kind of conscious that I'm probably taking it to a different direction also from what you were saying, Akshay. Um, but I've been wrestling with this notion that indigeneity or indigenous local knowledge, traditional knowledge is a constant set in time snapshot uh, of how people used to respond at some point, and that has remained stagnant over many years. So I've been wrestling with that idea because I feel like that has also been shifting, right? People respond to
What time frame do you say is indigenous and traditional,
exactly.
and what is not,
Exactly.
right?
Well,
Yeah.
there is
What
something
is
that is
that window?
indigenous. Yeah,
Uh,
where there is something that is indigenous, which is basically, linked to the land, linked to the forest, linked to the water. There is something that is very strongly indigenous about certain knowledge systems, yes. But at the same time, how do we differentiate that from all the other influences that do keep coming in, because as humans we've been influenced by very many things. So that is one of the things that I am sitting with as of now, and it's an open question in my mind in terms of uh, how do we wrestle with this idea of okay. And the other, I think, other more sort of problematic framing is the romanticism that surrounds the indigenous and the indigenous
mm,
knowledge. And this is not to say that a lot of that insight is not important. Lived experience is extremely important. That data, that knowledge, that understanding, that experience probably beats a lot of other strategies to deal with climate change. For a simple example,
mm,
I come from Gujarat. I come from Baroda. Our homes were traditionally designed with a water hole kind of a thing, a water tub or a water can for both animals and people. We come from a very hot area. It's, I mean, was always hot. We are used to heat waves. Heat waves were a thing before heat waves became a thing in the country. But
mm,
our homes were designed with those because it was a very common thing that okay, people who are traveling on the road or animals
mm,
that are outside strays need water. So we will put out water, and this was a common practice across our homes, which has changed, which is changing. But just giving an example of what that lived experience looks like, and how it's a very simple strategy that can be adopted by very many cities as we are heating up, as we are warming across, right?
mm,
But Gujarat itself is gentrifying. Our homes are now designed differently. Our apartment complexes are designed differently. So again, that understanding of what is lived experience. Um, where I was going with this was also problematizing of indigenous knowledge as everything being good is also a bit of a question
mm.
mark
It's not a
because
binary. It's not
it's
all
not a binary.
good, and it's not to be, don't
Exactly.
throw
It's
baby out with bathwater. So it's somewhere in between.
precisely. We need to take it into context. We need to take it into current context. We need to take it into the dynamic context of uh, what stands, what doesn't stand. So just giving that example of leaving out water, that probably stands. That's a simple strategy that could be adopted, but that's probably not indigenous experience. That's lived experience. Lived experience that has changed over time as people urbanize. They still put out water because we live
Yeah.
in a hot area, right? So, but like the whole, I think where indigeneity stands test of time, that I'm sure of, is the oneness with nature, that we are all connected, that we are one with nature, we are not different from nature, that we are all connected as humans, and that we are connected with a larger whole that that is larger than the sum of our individual parts. That whole idea as an indigenous knowledge system across the world, whether speaking to those in the Pacific or Hawaii or Australia or North America or South America or Africa, everywhere this kind of holds, that I think as a fundamental idea is I think what we really need to take in, and then the rest can be built in terms of context, in terms of um, the dynamism that exists in our world, and the emergence that exists in our world as well.
I'm just going to ask Vinuta and Nupur to also quickly respond so that we can kind of close on time. And Maitre has, in the last 9 minutes, dropped a bomb of a question uh, on interrogating scale, which I don't know if how we approach that, but I think it's such a powerful question. But yeah, Nupur is the first on this one, and then yeah.
I think the question of scaling adaptation.
No, not on the scaling adaptation. I think the question around capturing and indigenous and traditional knowledge and all of that.
Yeah, I think there's also we need to understand. Indigenous knowledge has a lot to living with nature, has a lot to do with the landscape. So I think we need to first understand which landscape we're talking about, right? Like indigenous knowledge, say in a desert, is not going to be scaled even to another desert in a different part of the world.
Mm.
So it's not like we will learn about say indigenous community and then that we create some sort of database of indigenous knowledge and use that. I really think we should definitely respect that knowledge because it comes from a experience that is different from us. Like all of us have been trained in a certain way. We went to a certain school. We've been educated to think in a certain way. And I think what's valuable is to try and understand how they think and how it's different. And where that type of thinking might lead us to a different adaptation strategy or understanding the impact of adaptation differently.
Thank you. Yeah, I think even from one desert to another, does it transfer at all? That's an interesting. Yeah. Vinuta, to close us out.
So I'm going to approach this at a personal level. I mean,
Please,
so
yeah.
I'm going to say from why I've constantly grappled with a very similar question, I think, is that, and mainly in response to what the climate crisis is going to do. And absolutely, the climate crisis is not the only crisis. We are facing multiple crises at the same time. But it feels like, or at least the science that one keeps hearing is that there is we are running out of time, and that's what one keeps hearing of. And it's not just with climate, I guess. It's even, with water systems or with, biodiversity loss. Everything seems to be happening much faster than we are able to grapple with. And that's when I'm left with the question of, so is it enough if we don't think of change that has to happen at a scale that could, address the problem, the crisis. But at the same time, I think the quality of that change has to be informed by the richness of local knowledge, local solutions, what actually makes sense locally. So I think it's a tension we cannot give up on. Like, we should be conscious of it, and we have to respond in the best way we can. But we need to be conscious of not, say, letting off governments when they, do something that's not at all in relation to the problem. So yeah, I feel like we need to be conscious of scale, but we have to respond with the richness of the detail. And then that's difficult, and but that's the tension we have to hold.
Wow. Nicely tied together the question that Maitreya put, and I see Shuchi put a very interesting paper as a link as well. So we'll share that out with everybody when we do we send out the recording. We're at 5:29. I have to close in a minute, unfortunately. But thank you so much to all three of you for so candidly sharing, everything, responses to these questions and all your insights and, examples. And I'm so grateful that we were able to have this conversation. I think this webinar series we've been doing started as an effort to just bring qualitative data to the fore. But I think now Yashna and I are just using it to get people we want to listen to together and ask them some questions. But I think I really appreciate the audience also. There were some really useful questions that everybody put in their registration forms, and some really powerful questions and thoughts in the chat as well. So huge appreciation to everybody who showed up on this Thursday evening or morning if you're joining us from elsewhere. But thank you so much. And we'll be sharing the recording for this and some resources from our panelists with you in an email, hopefully in a couple of days. But if not, then early next week. But yeah, thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.